Then we'll talk about some famous textual problems, and we will be looking at textual problems that are in the Gospels, in Paul's letters. We'll look at some in other parts of the New Testament as well, and we'll include the two most important, or I'd say the two biggest textual problems in the New Testament in terms of the number of verses. Mark 16, 9 through 20, and John 7, 53 through 8, 11. Those two passages involve 12 verses each, and there's a lot of emotional baggage that's attached to them in terms of are these authentic or not, and the people who fight over them, it's pretty dramatic and fascinating. Nevertheless, these two passages, we'll see if they affect any doctrines, and we'll also ask the question, are there other passages that are like this? The reality is, no, they're not. These are the largest passages by far of any textual variants. The next largest is 2 verses, and we have about 24 places where we have 1 or 2 verses. Then everything else after that is much smaller. So that gives you a basic overview. Then we're going to sum all this up and review some of the material in asking the questions what we have now, what they wrote then. So that gives you an overview of the course, and I'm exhausted just thinking about all these things. All right, let's begin with an introduction, definition, and goal of New Testament textual criticism. In general, we can say, and by in general I mean not related to the New Testament, but for any ancient document, we can say that textual criticism is the study of the copies of any written document, and by that we mean the handwritten copies of any written document whose original, which is often called the autograph, and I'm throwing some new terminology at you. There's a whole vocabulary you have to learn for textual criticism, but it's important to think through some of these. I'll keep it at a minimum. Whose original or autograph is unknown or no longer existent, for the primary purpose of determining the exact wording of the original. We even have to do textual criticism on documents that were written after the printing press was invented in 1454. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, we don't have the original document that Lincoln wrote out. What we have is 5 very early copies that were written, they're first generation copies written by his secretaries, and we have hundreds of people who were there when he gave the Gettysburg Address, journalists who took notes and published what he had to say in their newspapers. And so even on things during the era of the printing press, it's sometimes difficult to get it exactly right. But for the ancient documents, for the ancient world, we have virtually no original documents of any ancient literature. Now, we have original documents of non-literary things. A husband writes to his wife and says, please pick these things up at the grocery store. The son writes from the battlefield to his dad and tells him how the fight's going. Those are non-literary texts. As far as literary texts, we have virtually nothing. We have a scrap of 1 or 2 classical authors, just a few verses, and that's it. Now, for the New Testament, textual criticism is the study of the handwritten copies of the New Testament whose original, that is, the autograph, is unknown, or I would say non-existent. It's fell apart within 100 years of being written, for the primary purpose of determining the exact wording of that original text. That's the fundamental goal. So the definition and the goal of textual criticism are virtually identical. Now, why is textual criticism necessary for the New Testament? Well, the reason it's necessary is that, first of all, the autographs no longer exist. We don't have them anymore. Instead of the autographs, we have copies. They almost surely disappeared, as I suggested, within a century, and they would have been written on papyrus. Papyri, literary papyri, that is fairly decent quality papyri, that are used, occasionally, more than every few years, where someone has this as part of the library in their own home. They would have these papyrus rolls, and they'd have tags that they would attach to the papyrus roll to say, this is what this document is. And so there have been some studies very recently done that have suggested that these literary papyrus rolls that were used on a semi-frequent basis would last sometimes 200, even 300 years. Well, you compare that to the New Testament documents. We're talking about something that's not read just for literature. It's read because life is at stake, and life of a religious group that is persecuted, and they have to get this stuff right, and they have to get it disseminated. So these manuscripts would have been examined very frequently, and you can easily see a scenario like this. Paul writes a letter to the Romans. The Romans get a copy. Other churches find out, oh, you got a letter from Paul. Could we get a copy of that? And so the Romans write out a copy, send it to these folks, and they come across another copy of Paul's letter written by somebody else, copied by somebody else, and they said, wait a minute, there's some discrepancies between these two. Well, maybe we should send somebody to Rome to sort this thing out and take a look at the original document. This kind of thing must have happened over and over again. And so the original New Testament manuscripts would have worn out from being read out loud and from being copied so frequently. And so most scholars are quite convinced they would have just fallen apart within a century of their production. Well, so they no longer exist. The second reason why textual criticism is necessary is because there's differences among the copies. In fact, there's between 6 and 10 differences among the two closest early manuscripts we have per chapter. Well, you multiply that out by 260 chapters, we've got over 2,000 differences among these manuscripts. That's quite a few. And so then you look at manuscripts that don't agree with each other very much. Now we're looking at a pretty sizable number. Now, if we still had the autographs, then textual criticism would not be necessary. Why do it? You got the original, we know what it says, that's fine. But if we didn't have the autographs and yet all of the copies were exactly alike, then textual criticism would not be possible. It's not that it wouldn't be necessary. They might be all exactly alike based on a later copy. So it might still be necessary, but something that couldn't be done. This is, to a degree, that second category is to a degree what Muslims face. They claim that all copies of the Quran are exactly alike, which is actually not at all the case. But what we do know historically is that Caliph Uthman, the leader of the Muslim religion, within a few decades after Muhammad had lived, gathered up all the copies of the Quran. There were quite a few of them that were rather disparate from one another, and he burned all of them except his one preferred copy. And so then there were strong penalties about making any kinds of errors in the copying of the Quran from that point on. Well, that's very good for the history of the Quran after that point. It doesn't help us at all for recovering the Quran before Caliph Uthman came along. And so even Westcott and Hort talked about this, saying it's not possible to get back to the original Quran because Caliph Uthman destroyed all those earlier copies. So if we had the autographs, it wouldn't be necessary. If all the copies were exactly alike, textual criticism would not be possible. What's interesting is that even Bart Ehrman has a view that is very similar to what Muslims have about their own sacred texts. In fact, Ehrman's view is along the lines of what Textus Receptus people have. These folks who are King James only and God inspired only one text, and it's this Greek New Testament that Erasmus put together. They tend to say that's exactly what the original text said, and Ehrman has argued that if God took the trouble to inspire the texts, then he should have taken the trouble to preserve the text exactly in every single manuscript. Well, his problem with Christianity is that it's not Islam. His problem with the bibliology of us dealing with the text of the New Testament is that he wants it to be like what the Muslims claim for Islam and what KJV only people claim for the Textus Receptus. And yet no Christian theologian throughout the last 2,000 years has ever suggested, oh yeah, this is what we expect. that the text has been preserved exactly in all the manuscripts, just like the original. But that's what Ehrman wants. So, in a sense, you might say he's disappointed with the way God has done things. We'll talk about his views as we get into this course. Okay. Well, in this respect, textual criticism is no different from the textual criticism for any other major religion. That is, the New Testament textual criticism is no different. That is, we don't have the originals. The copies differ. And I said that Muslims argue that all of their copies are exactly alike, and yet even the Quran has manuscripts that have errors in them, although this has not been admitted by Muslims. The Quran is starting to be really seriously investigated by scholars in the last few years, and it's ramping up. Some Christian scholars and others who are examining the Quran, sometimes when a fatwa is put on their head for doing so. But here you have, for example, a leaf of a Quran manuscript that's got several erasures and rewrites in it. And this is a short leaf, very minimal text, and yet you see half a dozen places where the text has been erased and rewritten. There have been some Quran manuscripts that have been found recently that are in the process of being published that are known as palimpsest. That is, they're parchment manuscripts where the text was scraped off and it was reused and more text was written on top of it. The undertext is Quran and the upper text is Quran, but they don't say the same thing. And so you wonder why that happens. Well, it seems to have happened because these scribes felt that we can't have any mistakes in the Quran, and therefore, to make sure that we don't have any mistakes, we'll just erase that undertext that has those mistakes and create new ones. And now, with some phenomenal technology, we can read that undertext that we did not know existed before. So, the secondary objective, let's get back to the New Testament. The secondary objective is to trace the changes to the text in various places and times to gain a window on the shape of ancient Christianity. It's important for us to know how the Christian faith was played out, was worked out, was viewed in various regions in the ancient world. And what you need to recognize is this. The text that these people inherited, the one that they used, is the one that they considered to be the authorized, authoritative scripture. Just like in England, after 1611, the authorized scripture is the King James Bible. That's what God must have inspired, and that's what they used for centuries. Or the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, that was the principal text used by Roman Catholics for over a millennium. That is the inspired scripture. And whether those things match the original or not, the fact is that they are still what Christians in those parts of the world in those times are regarding as scripture. And so it's interesting to see what they consider to be scripture, and it's also interesting to see how they change scripture to fit in with their own cultural needs. There's going to be some things that they do that may be a little bit disturbing to us. But we also need to distinguish between manuscripts of the New Testament and manuscripts of other early Christian writings. For the most part, other early Christian writings are far more corrupt than New Testament manuscripts, especially those that were produced by heretics, or at least not people that were squeaky clean in their orthodoxy. Let me give you an illustration. The Gospel of Thomas had major textual upheavals. The Gospel of Thomas is not a Gnostic gospel, as many people think it is. It's kind of Gnostic-like or proto-Gnostic, or at least open to becoming Gnostic. It was found, the only full copy we have of it was found in Nag Hammadi in 1945. And we've discovered also at least 3 Greek fragments that we didn't know were part of the Gospel of Thomas until this whole gospel was published. But these fragments began to surface in the late 1800s. Nobody knew what they were. And they said, oh, the Gospel of Thomas, they're part of this. But when comparisons were made between the two, there was upheaval in the order of these sayings of Jesus and what the actual words were. The text really went through some significant changes. And Tim Raschuti has done the work on this. He was an intern of mine at Dallas Seminary. He studied Coptic and Greek and wrote a chapter in a book that I edited. The chapter is called Tracking Thomas, a text critical look at the transmission of the Gospel of Thomas. And he compared the Greek fragments with the Coptic in the places where they line up. And this was in Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament, a text that I edited for Kriegel in 2011. Important chapter, and these are important things for us to think about, that when it comes to the corruption of the New Testament, it doesn't go through the same kind of upheaval and really massive alteration that other ancient texts, even other ancient religious texts, go through.